The cold steel of the revolver pressed against Grace Vaughn's temple as her husband seethed, his whiskey-sour breath burning her nostrils. "No one would want damaged goods like you," Jeremiah hissed, his free hand gripping her wrist so tightly she feared the bones might snap. "You're nothing without me." The year was 1873, and in the small town of Cottonwood Springs, Colorado Territory, Grace's life had become a prison without bars. At 25, she had spent 7 years married to a man whose charming exterior masked a monster within. To the townsfolk, Jeremiah Vaughn was a successful businessman and upstanding citizen. Behind closed doors, he was a demon. Grace's dreams of children and a loving home had withered like untended flowers in the harsh western sun. Each month that passed without a child growing in her womb fueled Jeremiah's rage, as if her barrenness was a personal affront to his manhood. The accusations of worthlessness grew louder, the punishments more severe. "I want to leave," she whispered one evening, her bruised face half hidden by the curtain of her chestnut hair. "Please, Jeremiah, just let me go." His laughter was like ice water down her spine. "Leave and go where? Who would take in a barren woman approaching 30? You've failed at the one thing women are meant to do." That night, as Jeremiah slept off his whiskey, Grace packed a small bundle: a dress, a hairbrush, the locket from her mother, and the meager savings she'd managed to hide inside a hollowed-out Bible. By dawn, she was gone, riding west on a stolen mare, her heart hammering with equal parts terror and exhilaration. 2 weeks later, exhausted and nearly out of supplies, Grace spotted smoke rising from a chimney nestled in a copse of pines. Her mare, whom she'd named Liberty, nickered softly as they approached the modest cabin. Grace's stomach growled. She hadn't eaten properly in days, but caution made her hesitate. Men in these parts weren't always kind to women traveling alone. Before she could decide whether to approach or bypass the cabin, the door swung open. A tall man stepped out, rifle in hand, squinting into the distance. His gaze found her, and Grace's hand instinctively tightened on the reins, ready to flee. "Hold up there," the man called, lowering his weapon. "You look half-starved, madam. No need to run." The stranger's voice carried no threat, just concern, but Grace had learned the hard way that kindness often came with conditions. Still, she was desperate. "I'm just passing through," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "I don't mean to trespass." The man approached slowly, hands raised to show he meant no harm. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. A cowboy, judging by his worn leather chaps and the easy way he moved. "Name's Matthew Whitaker," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. "Got some stew on the fire and coffee brewing. You're welcome to both." Grace hesitated, weighing hunger against caution. "I can pay," she finally said, reaching for the coins sewn into her sleeve. Matthew shook his head. "No need for that. Hospitality's free in these parts." Reluctantly, Grace dismounted, wincing as her sore muscles protested. She'd been riding too long, sleeping on the hard ground, always looking over her shoulder. Inside the cabin, the rich aroma of beef stew made her mouth water. Matthew gestured to a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs. "Sit. You look ready to drop." Grace perched on the edge of a chair, watching as he ladled stew into a wooden bowl. When he placed it before her, she tried to eat slowly, maintaining dignity despite her ravenous hunger. "What brings a lady like you out here alone?" Matthew asked, pouring coffee into tin cups. Grace tensed. "Just traveling." "Most folks traveling have a destination," he observed mildly. "I'll know it when I find it." Her tone made it clear the subject was closed. Matthew nodded, respecting her silence. "Well, you're welcome to the barn loft tonight. It's clean and dry, better than sleeping rough." Grace wanted to refuse to maintain her independence, but exhaustion won out. "Thank you." As darkness fell, she settled into the hay-filled loft, wrapped in a blanket Matthew had provided. For the first time in weeks, she slept deeply, without fear of what morning might bring. Dawn arrived with the scent of frying bacon and the soft murmur of a deep voice. Grace peered down from the loft to see Matthew speaking to his horse, a magnificent chestnut gelding as he fed it. "Morning," he called, spotting her. "Breakfast's nearly ready." Over a meal of bacon, sourdough biscuits, and strong coffee, Matthew outlined his plans for the day. "I've got cattle to check in the north pasture. You're welcome to stay and rest." Grace shook her head. "I should move on, running from something?" Matthew asked, his gaze direct but kind. The question hung between them, heavier than it had any right to be. Grace stared into her coffee cup, the dark liquid reflecting her troubled expression. "Yes," she finally admitted, "my husband." Matthew's face remained impassive, but something hardened in his eyes. "He hurt you." It wasn't a question, but Grace nodded anyway. He said no one would want me, that I'm worthless." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. Matthew was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was steady and sure. Then he lied. The simple declaration, spoken without hesitation, brought unexpected tears to Grace's eyes. She blinked them away, unwilling to appear weak. "Stay," Matthew said. "At least until you're stronger. I could use some help around here, and I'd pay fair wages." Grace's instinct was to decline, to keep moving, but where would she go? Her meager funds were nearly depleted, and winter would arrive soon. "What sort of help?" "Nothing improper," Matthew assured her quickly. "Cooking, mending, the cabin's a mess without a woman's touch." He rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly looking boyish. "I'm gone most days with the herd." "You'd have your privacy." The offer was tempting, a safe place to recover, to plan her next move, to be something other than afraid. "Just until I save enough to move on," she clarified. Matthew nodded, extending his hand. "Deal." The days stretched into weeks, and Grace found a rhythm to life on the small ranch. She rose with the sun, prepared meals, cleaned the cabin, and mended Matthew's clothes. He was true to his word, leaving her alone during the days and treating her with unfailing respect. Slowly, tentatively, Grace began to feel safe. Her body healed, the bruises fading, the fear receding. She gained weight, her cheeks filling out, her eyes losing their haunted look. And she watched Matthew, his gentleness with animals, his quiet competence, the way he never raised his voice in anger. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Matthew told her his story. He'd come west after the war, a young lieutenant with nightmares and nowhere to go. He'd worked cattle drives until he saved enough for his own place. Now he ran about 100 head on land leased from the railroad, making a modest but honest living. "No wife?" Grace asked, immediately regretting the personal question. Matthew smiled ruefully. "Never found the right woman, or maybe never stayed in one place long enough to look properly." Grace nodded, understanding the appeal of movement, of not putting down roots that could trap you. As autumn deepened, bringing crisp mornings and golden aspens, Grace realized she was healing in ways beyond the physical. She laughed sometimes, sang softly as she worked, caught herself daydreaming. And more often than not, those dreams featured Matthew Whitaker. It was dangerous territory. She was still married, still legally bound to Jeremiah. And though Matthew had never made any improper advances, she sometimes caught him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Reality intruded one rainy afternoon when Matthew returned from town with troubling news. "There's a man in Silverdale asking about a woman matching your description," he said, shaking rain from his hat. "Offering a reward for information." Grace's heart plummeted. Silverdale was the nearest town, just 15 miles away. "Jeremiah," she whispered. Matthew nodded grimly. "I reckon so. Said he's looking for his beloved wife who wandered off in a state of confusion. Painted himself quite the concerned husband." Panic rose in Grace's throat. "I have to leave." "Now, no," Matthew said firmly. "Running again isn't the answer. You don't understand," she protested. "He'll kill me. He's promised as much." Matthew crossed the room, stopping just short of touching her. "I won't let that happen, Grace, but you can't spend your life running." "What choice do I have?" she demanded, tears threatening. "Face him. On your terms, not his." The very thought made her knees weak with terror. "How?" "We go to town tomorrow, see the sheriff, tell him the truth." Grace shook her head violently. The law won't help a wife against her husband. They'll just send me back to him. Not if we can prove he's dangerous, Matthew insisted, and not if you have someone standing with you. The way he said it, resolute, unwavering, gave Grace pause. Why would you risk yourself for me? Matthew's gaze softened. Because in the time you've been here, I've come to care for you, Grace. More than I should, maybe. The admission hung between them, fragile as spun glass. Grace looked away first, unable to bear the emotion in his eyes. I can't let you endanger yourself. It's not your decision to make, Matthew said gently. I'm going to town tomorrow. You can come with me or you can run again, but know this, I'll find a way to help you either way. That night, Grace barely slept, torn between flight and fight. By morning, determination had replaced fear. She would go to town with Matthew. She would face Jeremiah not alone this time, but with someone who believed in her worth. They rode into Silverdale just before noon, the small mining town bustling with activity. Grace kept her head down, her face partially hidden by a bonnet. Matthew led her directly to the sheriff's office, a squat building on the town's main street. Sheriff Porter was a grizzled man with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened impassively as Grace recounted her marriage, the abuse, her escape. Only when she showed him the fading bruises on her ribs did his expression soften with sympathy. Mrs. Vaughn, what your husband did was wrong, but not illegal, he said finally. The law gives a man certain rights over his wife. The law doesn't give any man the right to beat a woman half to death, Matthew interjected, anger evident in his voice. The sheriff sighed. No, it doesn't, but proving such things is difficult. It would be your word against his, madam. Then what can I do? Grace asked, desperation creeping into her voice. If I were you, Sheriff Porter said carefully, I'd consider divorce. It's not easy to obtain, mind you, especially for a woman. But with evidence of cruelty, it might be possible. Divorce. The word itself was scandalous, almost unthinkable. A divorced woman would be ostracized, viewed as damaged and immoral. Yet wasn't that better than living in terror or dying at Jeremiah's hands? Where would I even start? Grace asked. There's a judge in Denver who's known to be sympathetic to such cases, the sheriff replied. I could write you a letter of introduction. Matthew nodded decisively. We'll go to Denver then. The sheriff eyed him curiously. And what exactly is your interest in this matter, Mr. Whitaker? Before Matthew could answer, the office door burst open. Grace's blood froze at the sight of the man standing in the doorway, Jeremiah Vaughn, as immaculately dressed as ever, his handsome face a mask of concern. Grace, he exclaimed, stepping forward with outstretched arms. Thank God you're safe. I've been out of my mind with worry. Grace shrank back, bumping into Matthew, who steadied her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. Jeremiah's gaze hardened as he took in the scene. Who is this man? He demanded, turning to the sheriff. Has he been harboring my wife? I want him arrested. Now hold on, Sheriff Porter said, raising a calming hand. Let's all settle down. There's nothing to settle, Jeremiah snapped. That's my wife, and I'm taking her home. Any man who keeps a wife from her husband is breaking the law. Matthew stepped forward, placing himself between Grace and Jeremiah. Any man who beats his wife forfeits the right to call himself a husband. Jeremiah's handsome face contorted with rage. You dare accuse me? I am a respected businessman. This cowboy has obviously filled my poor wife's head with lies. Grace has always been fragile, prone to flights of fancy. I'm not lying, Grace said, her voice stronger than she expected. Show him, Sheriff, show him the bruises. The sheriff looked uncomfortable. Mr. Vaughn, your wife has made some serious allegations. Allegations she can't prove, Jeremiah countered smoothly. Grace, darling, it's time to come home. Whatever this man has promised you, whatever fantastical future he's painted, it's not real. You belong with me where you're safe and provided for. Grace felt Matthew tense beside her but was surprised when he remained silent, allowing her to fight her own battle. I'm not going back with you, she said firmly. I'm filing for divorce. Jeremiah's laugh was cold and mocking. Divorce. On what grounds? What judge would grant it? You have no money, no family, no connections, and who would want you afterward? A barren, divorced woman approaching 30. The words were calculated to wound, to remind her of her supposed worthlessness. Once they would have cut her to the quick. Now they merely strengthened her resolve. "You're wrong," she said quietly, "about all of it." Jeremiah's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You'll regret this defiance, Grace, I promise you that." "Is that a threat, Mr. Vaughn?" the sheriff asked sharply. Jeremiah composed himself quickly. "Of course not. I'm simply concerned for my wife's well-being. She's clearly not thinking clearly." "I've never thought more clearly," Grace countered. The standoff might have continued indefinitely had the door not opened again, admitting a slender woman with graying hair and kind eyes. "Sheriff Porter, I brought those." The woman stopped short, her gaze moving from face to face before settling on Jeremiah. "Mr. Vaughn, Mrs. Henderson," Jeremiah acknowledged stiffly. Grace recognized the woman as the widow who ran the town's only hotel. She had no idea how Mrs. Henderson knew Jeremiah, but the chill in the older woman's voice was unmistakable. "Sheriff," Mrs. Henderson said, "may I speak with you privately?" The sheriff nodded, curious, and led her to a corner of the room. Jeremiah's confident demeanor faltered slightly as he watched them whisper. When Mrs. Henderson pulled up her sleeve to reveal a faded scar on her wrist, his face paled. The sheriff returned, his expression grave. "Mr. Vaughn, it seems you have a history I wasn't aware of. Mrs. Henderson has some disturbing tales about your time in St. Louis." "Lies and slander," Jeremiah hissed. "That woman has always had it out for me." "Perhaps," the sheriff allowed, "but I'm inclined to give Mrs. Vaughn's claims more credence now. I suggest you return to your hotel while I sort this out." Jeremiah's facade cracked, revealing the rage beneath. "You can't keep my wife from me. I can if I suspect she's in danger," Sheriff Porter countered firmly. "Now go, before I decide to hold you for questioning." With a last venomous glare at Grace, Jeremiah stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The sheriff turned to Mrs. Henderson. "Would you be willing to make an official statement about what you know?" The older woman nodded. "I've kept silent too long. That man nearly killed my niece back in St. Louis. She was his first wife, the one he told everyone died of fever." Grace gasped. "He was married before." "Yes, to my sweet Emily. By the time I realized what was happening and got her away from him, she was broken in spirit. She never recovered, died last year." Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with tears. "I heard rumors he'd remarried and moved west, but I never expected to find him here." The revelation that Jeremiah had killed before, or at least driven a woman to her death, sent ice through Grace's veins. If Mrs. Henderson was telling the truth, Grace's own fate might have been sealed long ago. "This changes things," the sheriff said grimly. "Mrs. Vaughn, I believe you have grounds not just for divorce but for an annulment. If Mr. Vaughn was already married when he wed you, your marriage isn't valid under the law." Hope flickered in Grace's chest, cautious but real. "What do I need to do? I'll wire the authorities in St. Louis for confirmation of his first marriage and any records of Emily Henderson's death. In the meantime, you should stay somewhere safe." "She'll stay with me," Mrs. Henderson offered immediately. "My hotel has a back entrance. Jeremiah won't know she's there." Matthew, who had remained silent through these revelations, finally spoke. "I'll be nearby if you need me, Grace." She nodded, grateful beyond words for his steady presence. As they prepared to leave the sheriff's office, Matthew pulled her aside. "This changes nothing about what I said before," he murmured. "I still care for you, more than care." Grace's heart fluttered traitorously. "Matthew, my life is so uncertain right now, I don't know what tomorrow will bring." "I do," he replied confidently. "It'll bring us one day closer to you being free, and when that day comes, I'll still be here." The promise sustained Grace through the anxious days that followed. She remained hidden in Mrs. Henderson's private quarters above the hotel, venturing out only after dark for brief moments of fresh air. Matthew visited daily, bringing news and reassurance. Jeremiah, meanwhile, grew increasingly desperate. He prowled the town, alternating between charming inquiries and thinly veiled threats. Few were fooled, especially after Mrs. Henderson began sharing her story with trusted townswomen. Slowly, public opinion turned against him. On the fourth day, Sheriff Porter received a telegram from St. Louis confirming Emily Henderson's marriage to Jeremiah Vaughn and the suspicious circumstances surrounding her illness. It wasn't proof of murder, but it was enough to establish that Grace's marriage was invalid. Jeremiah had still been legally married to Emily when he wed Grace. Armed with this information, the sheriff confronted Jeremiah at his hotel room. "You're finished in this town, Vaughn," he declared. "Your marriage to Grace Vaughn is null and void. You committed fraud, and I've half a mind to arrest you for it." Jeremiah's response was swift and violent. He lunged at the sheriff with a concealed knife, slashing the lawman's arm before fleeing through the window. By the time a posse was organized, Jeremiah had stolen a horse and disappeared into the mountains. The sheriff posted warnings and sent telegrams to neighboring towns, but Grace knew the danger wasn't over. Jeremiah wouldn't give up so easily. His pride had been wounded, his control threatened. He would return for her, she was certain of it. "Come back to the ranch with me," Matthew urged when he heard about Jeremiah's escape. "It's isolated, defensible. You'll be safer there than in town." Grace hesitated, torn between fear for her safety and concern for Matthew's. "If he finds me there, he'll hurt you too." "Let him try," Matthew said grimly, patting the revolver at his hip. Mrs. Henderson, who had become something of a maternal figure to Grace, squeezed her hand. "Go with Mr. Whitaker, dear. A woman needs protection in times like these." And she added with a knowing look, "There's more than one kind of protection a good man can offer." The implication made Grace blush, but she couldn't deny the truth of it. Matthew offered more than physical safety. He offered a future, a life where she might be valued and loved as an equal. They left for the ranch the following morning, traveling cautiously, staying off the main trails. Matthew rode slightly ahead, vigilant, one hand never far from his weapon. Grace found his protectiveness comforting rather than stifling, unlike Jeremiah's controlling behavior. Matthew's concern stemmed from genuine care. The ranch seemed untouched when they arrived, but Matthew insisted on checking every building before allowing Grace inside the cabin. Only when he was satisfied did he relax slightly, building a fire to ward off the autumn chill. "We'll need to be careful," he said, pouring coffee for them both. "No lights after dark. I'll sleep in the barn where I can see anyone approaching." Grace nodded, though the thought of being alone in the cabin made her uneasy. "How long do you think we'll need to live like this?" Matthew considered the question. "The sheriff thinks Jeremiah will try to leave the territory. Too many people know about his past now. But men like him don't give up easily on what they consider theirs." "I was never his," Grace said softly. "Not really, he owned me, but that's not the same as being his." Matthew's eyes darkened with emotion. "No, it's not." After a pause, he added, "You know, when all this is over, when you're truly free, I'd like to court you properly." The simple declaration, so honest and earnest, brought tears to Grace's eyes. "I'd like that too." They settled into a tense routine over the next few days. Matthew tended his cattle but stayed close to the ranch house, always within earshot. Grace kept busy with domestic tasks, finding comfort in the familiar work. Each night, Matthew checked the perimeter before retreating to the barn, rifle at his side. On the fifth night, a storm rolled in, bringing howling wind and sheets of rain. Grace sat by the fire, jumping at each crack of thunder, straining to hear anything suspicious beneath nature's fury. When a particularly violent gust rattled the windows, she decided to check that all was secure. As she approached the door, it burst open, revealing a drenched figure silhouetted by lightning. Jeremiah stood before her, water streaming from his once immaculate clothes, his eyes wild with rage. "Found you," he snarled, advancing into the room. Grace stumbled backward, reaching for anything to use as a weapon. "Matthew," she screamed, hoping her voice would carry through the storm. Jeremiah laughed. "Your cowboy can't help you. He's a bit Indisposed at the moment, fear for Matthew nearly overwhelmed Grace. What did you do to him? Nothing he won't recover from, eventually. Jeremiah closed the distance between them, grabbing her arm. You've caused me a great deal of trouble, Grace, made me a laughingstock. No wife of mine defies me and gets away with it. I'm not your wife, Grace spat, struggling against his grip. I never was. You were already married when you tricked me into marrying you. His hand connected with her face, the familiar sting of his violence igniting not fear but fury within her. Grace had promised herself she would never be a victim again. With a surge of desperate strength, she brought her knee up sharply between his legs. Jeremiah doubled over, cursing viciously. Grace seized her chance, grabbing the iron poker from beside the fireplace and swinging it with all her might. It connected with his shoulder, eliciting a howl of pain. You'll pay for that, Jeremiah snarled, straightening and drawing a revolver from his coat. I should have done this years ago. As he leveled the gun at her, the cabin door crashed open again. Matthew stood in the doorway, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, his own revolver already drawn. Drop it, Vaughn, he commanded. Jeremiah spun, firing wildly. The bullet splintered wood near Matthew's head. Before he could fire again, Matthew's shot rang out, striking Jeremiah in the chest. The businessman staggered, his face a mask of disbelief, before crumpling to the floor. Grace stood frozen, the poker still clutched in her hands as Matthew cautiously approached the fallen man. After checking for a pulse, he looked up at her, his expression grim but certain. He's dead. The simple pronouncement should have horrified Grace. Instead, she felt a weight lifting the oppressive fear that had shadowed her for years, suddenly gone. Her legs gave way and she sank to the floor, the poker clattering beside her. Matthew was at her side in an instant, gathering her into his arms, his heartbeat strong and steady against her cheek. It's over, Grace, it's really over. She couldn't speak, could only cling to him as relief and shock warred within her. They stayed like that until the storm subsided, the violence of nature receding with the violence of the man who had tormented her. At dawn, they rode to town to report what had happened. Sheriff Porter took Matthew's statement, examined the defensive wounds on both Grace and Matthew, and ruled the shooting justified. Jeremiah's body was buried in the potter's field, unmarked and unmourned. News travels fast in small towns. By evening, everyone knew that Grace was a free woman and that Jeremiah Vaughn had been a murderous fraud. Rather than facing scorn, Grace found herself the recipient of sympathy and support, particularly from the town's women. You're welcome to stay, Mrs. Henderson told her. I could use help with the hotel and you'd have a home here. The offer was generous, but Grace's gaze drifted to where Matthew waited patiently across the street. Thank you, but I think my place is elsewhere. Mrs. Henderson followed her gaze and smiled knowingly. I suspected as much. He's a good man, your Mr. Whitaker. Don't let past hurts keep you from future happiness. Matthew straightened as Grace approached, his expression cautiously hopeful. Ready to go home, he asked simply. Home. The word carried such weight, such promise. Yes, Grace replied, taking his outstretched hand. I believe I am. The seasons turned, bringing change and healing. Winter blanketed the ranch in pristine snow, giving Grace and Matthew quiet evenings by the fire to learn each other's hearts. Matthew courted her properly, as he'd promised, with respect, patience, and an unwavering tenderness that slowly mended her broken trust. By spring, when the first wildflowers dotted the meadows, Grace wore Matthew's ring and his name. Their wedding was small but joyful, attended by Mrs. Henderson and a few friends from town. The local preacher spoke of new beginnings, of love that builds rather than destroys, and Grace felt each word resonate in her soul. Summer brought unexpected news, a child growing within her womb. The doctor in Denver, whom they consulted after years of Grace believing herself barren, confirmed that the trauma and stress of her first marriage had likely prevented conception. With proper care and peace of mind, there was no reason she couldn't bear healthy children. Matthew wept when she told him, unashamed of his tears. "A family of our own," he whispered against her hair. "Grace, you've made me the happiest man alive." As autumn painted the aspen trees gold once more, marking a year since their paths first crossed, Grace sat on the porch of their expanded cabin, her hand resting on her swollen belly. Matthew worked nearby, building a cradle from pine wood, whistling as he shaped the piece that would rock their child to sleep. "Do you ever think about him?" Matthew asked suddenly, looking up from his work. "About what happened?" Grace considered the question. "Sometimes." Not with fear anymore, but with gratitude, in a way. Matthew raised an eyebrow, puzzled. "If not for Jeremiah's cruelty, I might never have found the courage to leave, and if I hadn't left, I wouldn't have found you." She smiled, feeling the baby kick against her palm. "His greatest lie gave me my greatest truth." Matthew set aside his tools and came to sit beside her, placing his calloused hand over hers. "And what truth is that? That I am wanted," she said simply. "That I am worthy of love." "You are more than worthy," Matthew affirmed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You are essential, irreplaceable, my heart, my home, my future." As the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Grace leaned against her husband's shoulder, perfectly at peace. The scars of her past would always be part of her story, but they no longer defined her. She was Grace Whitaker, now wife, soon-to-be mother survivor, and she was loved beyond measure. When their daughter was born that winter, a healthy, squalling miracle with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit, they named her Hope. It seemed fitting for a child born of second chances, of promises kept, of love that had proven stronger than the darkest despair. As the years passed, the Whitaker ranch prospered. They added a son to their family, then twin girls who kept everyone on their toes with their mischievous antics. Matthew expanded their herd, built a larger house, and eventually bought the land outright from the railroad. Grace found purpose beyond motherhood, using her experiences to help other women in difficult situations. With Mrs. Henderson's assistance, she established a small refuge at the edge of town where women could find temporary shelter and support. It wasn't much, but it offered options where once there had been none. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Matthew surprised Grace with a locket to replace the one she'd brought with her when she fled. Inside was a tiny portrait of their family and an inscription, "To my Grace, who taught me the meaning of courage." That night, as their children slept and moonlight spilled through the bedroom window, Grace traced the lines of her husband's face with gentle fingers. "Any regrets?" she asked softly. Matthew caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Only that I didn't find you sooner." "We found each other exactly when we needed to," Grace corrected, settling into his embrace. As sleep claimed them, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her here from prisoner to fugitive to beloved wife. She had learned that freedom wasn't just the absence of chains, but the presence of choice. And she had chosen love, chosen family, chosen a man who saw her value when she couldn't see it herself. Her husband had said no one would want her. The cowboy had said he lied. And in proving Jeremiah wrong, Matthew Whitaker had given Grace the greatest gift of all, the courage to believe in herself. In the wild, untamed West, where fortunes were made and lost on a gambler's whim and death often rode alongside hope, Grace and Matthew had found something rare and precious. A love strong enough to heal past wounds and build a future worth fighting for. And that, Grace knew with absolute certainty, was worth everything they had endured to claim it.